John Chapman was born in 1774 in Leominster, Massachusetts. As a boy, he worked in the apple orchard of a neighbor near his family farm. In 1792, he left home and moved west. In Warren County, Pennsylvania, he planted his first apple orchard, and he sold saplings to settlers as they moved into the area. Now, while he was in Pennsylvania, he learned about the Church of the New Jerusalem, which was founded by Emanuel Swedenborg. So it's sometimes, if you're good at pronunciation, it is sometimes known as the Swedenborgian Church. You don't want to do that while you're chewing gum, that's for sure. So he was so inspired by this church that he kind of acted as a lay missionary, if you will. He began to spread the teachings of the church. So his business idea was to establish orchards or nurseries for apple trees before settlers started coming into an area. So he wanted to have a 2 to 3 year head start on people moving into an area, so he would have saplings that were big enough to sell. And of course, this concept required that he was pretty constantly on the move. So let's take a look at what became Ohio. 95% of the land where we live today was heavily forested. It was heavily forested. The only way to move around was via the rivers. The only transport was via the rivers. So this map is like the equivalent of our interstate highway system today. That's a map of the rivers, and that's how people moved around, because it was very, very difficult with the heavy forestation. In about 1800, John left Pennsylvania, so he was just a bit north of Pittsburgh. He came down the Allegheny River to the Ohio River. Let's look at another map of Ohio. This is actually a map that was drawn in 1945, which was 100 years after John Chapman's death. John established his first orchard in what is now Ohio, just south of where Steubenville is today. And that was around 1800. His family from Massachusetts moved west to Marietta in 1805. So there's Marietta, which was the first European-American settlement in Ohio. He helped them to build their cabin, and then he set off up the Muskingum River to Licking Creek and established an orchard there. Now, when he came to a promising spot, he would either buy the land, or in many cases, he would simply use the land. And this was true especially since he often preceded the surveyors. He couldn't buy the land until it was surveyed. So he would reach an area, he would find good bottom land, the rich soil that is by the rivers and creeks, and he would clear the area and he would plant his orchard. He would fence it in with the trees and the limbs and brush that he had cut down. He would fence it against animals, deer, and so forth. We know all about those even today, right? So to protect his nursery against those. He would not stay long once he had established a new nursery. He would move on, but he would come back to check on his plants. And after 2 to 3 years, then, he would have plants that were big enough to sell to incoming settlers. Each year, he returned to western Pennsylvania in the wintertime, and he would get new apple seed from cider mills in Pennsylvania. So you'll notice that he was planting from seed. He did not believe in grafting. So he planted from seed. So the vast majority of the apple trees that he planted would have been good only for cider, which was perfectly fine with the settlers. He lived a simple life. He wore cast-off clothing. Reportedly, he did not eat meat. He lived alone in the woods when necessary, but he always welcomed the opportunity to stay at a settler's cabin, where he would have the opportunity to sleep in shelter on the floor. And when he entered a cabin, now remember, he was very interested in this religion, and when he entered a cabin, he would greet the people saying, "I have good news fresh from heaven." And he would tell them about the religion. He would read to them from tracts that he had purchased. He would read to them from the Bible. Now, people on the frontier had very little cash money. As a matter of fact, at this time, there was not even a national currency for the country yet. Most commerce was done by bartering. And that's the way John worked as well, primarily. He would receive supplies from settlers. He would get cornmeal. He would get maybe some used clothing, a pair of shoes that someone no longer needed, and in turn he would barter apple saplings. If a new settler had nothing to trade, and an incoming settler may very well have no money and, of course, nothing to trade, he would give them the trees. And he would say, "Come back when you can and pay me for them." And some might do that and some might not. What cash he did make, he sent to Philadelphia to purchase literature about the Swedenborgian religion, which he would then distribute to people that he encountered. Okay, so he's established these orchards in the area of Licking Creek. Around 1810, he moved up to the Mansfield area, and that was his base for the next 20 years. Now, he leased a 160-acre school section in Ashland County, and here's the historical marker for that. So when the land was surveyed, it was surveyed into, actually the federal survey, six townships that were 6 square miles, 6 miles on a side, and those were subdivided into sections that were 160 acres. So there were 36 sections. The law said that one of those 36 sections was called a school section. The money that was never sold, it was only leased. So that meant you had payments every year. The money from that payment went to support schools, went to pay for schools. So it sounds a little odd, school section. You think that's where they built the schools. That's not where they built the schools. It was the funds from renting, essentially, that land that went to pay for schooling in that particular township. Okay. So he bought a school section. Now, an interesting thing about the school sections, there were more requirements on that than any other section that you bought, because they wanted somebody who bought that to be actually settling on that, not buying it to resell in smaller parcels to someone else. So if you bought a school section, you were required to clear it, to fence it, and to plant 100 apple trees, because that was proof that you were going to settle. Well, that was easy for John Chapman, right? Because that's what's his intention anyway. Now, as the area around Mansfield came to be more settled, John moved further west to the Maumee River. There was a canal that was being built from the lake all the way down to the Ohio River, and he knew that would bring settlers. Was called the Miami and Erie Canal. So he located one nursery, for example, in what would become Defiance, and there's a historical marker there. Now, John was an eccentric, well-known figure, and stories about him began to be circulated while he was alive. And that's pretty unusual. These days, with the internet and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, people come to be well known. But in those frontier days, that's very unusual. But he was a well-known character, and stories began to be circulated about him, and people would say that they knew him that never had any chance of meeting him. There's a record of one man that remembers when John Chapman came to his father's house, and the guy was 6 months old at the time. I mean, give me a break. Everybody was claiming to know him. So the stories about him, as you can imagine, are often quite exaggerated or attributed to different people.